My name is Cannon Clark. I work for People's Company in Diligent Development, and just want to welcome you guys to our 7th annual Builder Developer Luncheon. For those of you who don't know or haven't seen that video before, that is from the Greater Des Moines Partnership, video they put together fantastically for their annual report. And our next speaker doesn't really need much of an introduction after that, but Jay Byers, the CEO of the Greater Des Moines Partnership.
Thanks, Cannon, and thanks to all of you for coming out today. A special thanks to my good friend Steve Brewer and People's Company for putting this event on, for being a partnership investor, and for all they've done to really do some really great things all across Central Iowa. So let's give Steve and People's a big round of applause. As Cannon mentioned, my name is Jay Byers. I'm the CEO of the Greater Des Moines Partnership, and thanks for showing our annual dinner video. If you were at our event where we had Bob Costas, that's where we rolled this out. But again, it does a great job, I think, of really showing what happened in 2013, which was a really extraordinary year for all of us. For those of you who aren't aware of the Greater Des Moines Partnership, we are the regional economic and community development organization serving Central Iowa. We are currently doing economic development in 7 counties here in Central Iowa. We have 21 affiliate chambers of commerce that we have dual membership with, and as a result, we have more than 5,000 members all across Central Iowa. So a very powerful, unified voice for economic growth, which has been a big part, we like to think, of the success that we've seen here in Central Iowa in recent years. And it really is an amazing time here in Central Iowa, and I hope all of you feel that as well. So just a few statistics real quick. Over the last decade, we've seen a population growth in Central Iowa of almost 20%. Unemployment is currently at 4.4% here in Central Iowa. Housing starts are approaching pre-recession levels. So I know my friend Creighton appreciates that very much. We have a very strong outlook for commercial development. The employments at the Des Moines Airport are at record levels. 2013 and in the last couple of years, the economic development deals have been extraordinary. It's been a record level on many levels, and I'm just going to mention a few of these in terms of what they mean in terms of overall capital investment. It's an extraordinary list. Bridgestone Firestone, $151 million. DuPont Pioneer, $154 million. Facebook, $300 million. John Deere, $85 million, Kemin, $40 million, Microsoft, $877 million, Principal Financial Group, $400 million, Toro, $17 million, Wells Fargo, $100 million. There's lots and lots of others, but that is an extraordinary list within the last couple of years. And then at the same time, we've been getting these incredible national rankings, and you saw some of those in the video, but I'm just going to go through some of them again because it's really been an amazing list. Number 1 best place for young professionals, Forbes. Number 1 best city for families, Kiplinger. Number 2 best cities to start a business, The Street. Number 2 strongest local economy, Polycom. Number 1 best place for business and careers, Forbes. And most recently, within the last month or so, the Today Show, the number 1 wealthiest city in America. Those rankings are all of Central Iowa's rankings. They're your rankings. It's all of you that are out there getting it done every day are the reason we're getting those rankings. So give yourselves a big round of applause. And while we have a lot to be thankful for, we have a lot to celebrate, the future is even more exciting. And the last thing that we really need to do as a region is sit here and pat ourselves on the back and say, boy, look at these great rankings, look at these great deals. Because the minute you start getting complacent is when your competition catches up with you. So we need to really leverage what we've done. We need to build on these successes and work even harder moving forward. And that's what the partnership is all about. And we also, at the partnership, spend a lot of time thinking about what do we need to do in terms of regional planning, regional vision plans to really propel us to that whole next level. And hopefully all of you have heard of Capital Crossroads, which is our regional vision plan. We've got 11 different platforms moving forward. There's a lot of exciting things that have happened in the last 2 years. And 2014 is locked and loaded with some amazing things that we're going to be rolling out here in the next couple of months. Everything from the new branding strategy for the Capital Corridor to highlight our regional biosciences, hosting a global insurance symposium, and lots of other things. Again, Central Iowa has a history of fighting above our weight. We're able to do that for a number of reasons. We believe in and practice regionalism. City of Des Moines only has 200,000 people. The MSA only has about under 600,000. That 50-mile radius of downtown is approaching 850,000. We'd like to get that closer to 1 million. But again, we are competing with cities and regions that are much, much bigger than ours because we're able to work together. We also believe in public-private partnerships. The Greater Des Moines Partnership is one of those examples, but if you look all across the region and all the great things that are happening, it's public-private partnerships are really hot right now, but we've understood it for a long time, and that's one of the reasons we're able to get it done. And third is the leadership. It's those of you sitting around this room, whether it's engaged with the partnership, other organizations, people show up with their time and their resources, and there's very, very strong leadership. And those are the reasons we continue to fight above our weight, and we're going to do it even more. We're going to take the next level. It's companies like Peoples, again, that are out there on the ground every day getting it done, and we really appreciate it. Anything we can do to make you more successful, to make all of you more successful, that's what we want to do, and that's our mission. So again, thanks for including the partnership in this event today, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the remarks, and I look forward to working with all of you into the future. So with that, I'm going to bring Cannon back up. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jay. As he mentioned, Peoples and Steve are an investor in the partnership, and I would welcome all of you in the room, if you're not already, to also invest in the projects that they're working to facilitate in the Des Moines metro area. Trying to get you in and out of here as fast as possible today, so I won't hesitate here. But 3 years ago, we brought this gentleman into our Land Investment Expo with every attempt to stump him or come up with a question that he couldn't answer and just blow our minds. We tried again last night at dinner, and he's yet to cease to amaze us with an answer. No notes, no presentation. He's speaking from the hip. Dr. Vincent Malanga with LaSalle Economics.
Thank you, Ken. Good afternoon. Well, I must say, listening to Jay's quick remarks there, you have to be the envy of a lot of different areas around the United States. So I'll take it upon myself this afternoon to try and dampen your enthusiasm somewhat. I'm going to start with some general remarks, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on 3 areas which I think are probably near and dear to all your hearts. The first one being some observations about the current equity market environment. The second being the position of the farm economy. And then third and finally, the general construction outlook. I can say that the recovery from the Great Recession, as it's been called, really began in the spring of 2009. And so now it's nearly 5 years old, and the general economy has pretty much enjoyed a lengthy period of now uninterrupted growth. Unfortunately, though, at least in a macro sense, that growth has been really pales in comparison to the typical recoveries from recessions in the post-war period, post-World War II period. And in fact, it more closely resembles the period of the 1930s than it does anything else. Growth has been sluggish, but it's been uninterrupted. And I would attribute that really to three factors, some of which are now working at cross purposes and sort of therefore self-defeating. The first one is the fact that coming out of this recession, all of a sudden, for the first time in the post-World War II period, debt took on a bad name. It was viewed that households were simply over-indebted relative to income. Business had too much debt on their balance sheets. And of course, governments worldwide, not only the United States, but particularly other areas of the world, had just let debt explode relative to the size of their economies. And of course, the poster child for that was Greece, which of course really went through very tough times in the period from 2011 through 2012. And so I think there's a general feeling with debt being so overloaded that there was really an attempt on the part of households, businesses, and governments to sort of pare back debt. Not necessarily in an absolute sense, but certainly in a relative sense, whereas debt would then start to grow much slower than the overall rise in income or the overall rise in gross domestic product, which is the measure of national output. And as a result of that, the policy response to that was to try and pare back spending and consequently increase saving. And to a large extent, and to some extent, that's actually been successful. Household debt ratios are now much more conservatively aligned with income than they were, say, in the 2005-2008 period. And believe it or not, despite the fact that the size of government generally has grown, government size relative to the economy has actually shrunk over the last 3 or 4 years. Not necessarily willingly, but nevertheless, there has been some discipline imposed on the federal government, which has actually slowed the rate of growth of spending and increased the level of taxation. Most notably, the Budget Control Act was passed in 2011, and it put serious restraints on non-defense spending. It introduced a sequester, which affected both defense spending and non-defense spending. And it culminated with a general rise in tax rates in December of 2012, which primarily affected the most upper income echelon of the economy. And if you haven't adjusted your withholding tables and the like for the tax increases that were instituted in December 2012, I got news for you. You're going to be in for a shock when April 15th comes around if you're in these high-income groups. Not only were tax rates at the high-income level raised, but in addition, in 2013, Obamacare tax increases went into effect, which raised the rate of the capital gains tax by 5 percentage points, which imposed a surtax on Medicare payments, and also, and one that has sort of crept in and many people are not aware of, but for those of you who have itemized and who have medical deductions, in the past it was 7%, 7.5% of your adjusted gross income before you could take medical cost deductions. Beginning in 2013, that went up to 10%. And so those with outstanding medical expenses that you haven't known about, you're in for a rude awakening. And I think these types of things, the reduction in debt, increased taxes, slowdown in spending, and other types of things have really acted as a restraint on the ability of the economy to grow. In the long run, I think debt reduction and spending discipline is a good thing. But in the short run, it has its consequences. And one of those consequences is a reduction in aggregate demand from what demand conditions in the economy otherwise would have been. That's one of the areas I think that's distinguished this recovery from prior ones. The other one is that suddenly credit lending institutions, really beginning after the housing crash in 2007, 8, 9, credit lending institutions really began to take on a bad name. Banks were really viewed as villains in this whole environment that the economy went through over the last 7 years. And as a result, the consequence of that was twofold. Number one, regulatory constraints were imposed on the banking system through Dodd-Frank legislation. And number two, and probably more unfortunate than anything else, is that it almost felt like the government was obliged to get retribution for a lot of the things that were attributed to the banking system in the earlier part of the decade. And so I think for the first time ever, we've seen a lot of prosecutorial measures introduced in the past couple of years against the big banks in order to try and get payback for mortgage fraud and other types of alleged violations that took place over the course of the last 10 years. Well, the only problem with that is that retribution and regulation actually do have real-world consequences. And in fact, the result of that has been to make the big banks, particularly the national banks, much more conservative lenders than they had ever been throughout the entire post-World War II period. It wasn't just housing and mortgage loans that were affected by this, but it was basically borrowing in general. There were much stiffer requirements imposed on potential borrowers. Loans became harder to get. And as a result, that has had a tendency to slow down what we refer to as the velocity of money, the number of times that money turns over in the economy in a given period. And as money velocity slows down, it tends to slow down economic activity. I think on balance that those two phenomena were really in the backbone of the slowdown in the economic recovery that we've experienced over the past 4 or 5 years. And it wasn't only in the United States. These same types of phenomena were really occurring throughout Europe, and they were occurring most everywhere else in the world, even to a more modest extent in Asia and particularly China, and of course in Japan. And so universally, globally, there was really no engine for vibrant economic growth. And as a result, we sort of became engaged in this long slog. Well, with government policy, in effect, sort of neutered in this period, it really became the job of central banks. In this country, the Federal Reserve. In Europe, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of China, etc. It really became the task of central banks to try and take on the burden of engineering an economic recovery as part of an offset to the restraints imposed by government. And central banks went at it, and they really did go at it. Short-term interest rates collapsed over this period. Long-term interest rates came down sharply. The Federal Reserve introduced a zero interest rate policy at the short end of the market back in 2009, and that has persisted to date. In fact, at the time when the Fed moved toward its zero interest rate policy, we made sort of the bold statement in our shop that we thought interest rates at the short end would probably stay at zero at least through 2017. And as I was saying to the guys last night, here it is 2014, and as yet I don't see any reason to think that short-term rates are going to deviate from the zero bound at least for the next 3 years. But the Fed and other central banks, their main task was to pump liquidity into the global economy. And they have been pumping liquidity with reckless abandon since the onset of economic recovery. And so not only are short-term interest rates at the zero bound, but long-term interest rates are as low as they have been, or lower than at any time in the post-World War II period. The purpose of this was, in effect, to try and generate private sector demand. The idea of low interest rates was to get people, to get households, to get businesses to, in effect, become more desperate, more willing to take on risk. And that risk would come in the form of going out and buying houses, building capital equipment, buying capital equipment and building facilities and the like. And to a certain degree, it has worked. The national housing economy has recovered over the past 2 or 3 years in particular. Housing prices have sort of strengthened and the like. Capital equipment, capital investment, generally speaking, in the economy has still been disappointing because business has not yet seized the reins, and I'll talk more about that later. And the household sector, as I mentioned, has reduced its debt burden and has begun to loosen the purse strings somewhat. So central banks have had some success in offsetting the policies of government on the fiscal side, but that success has been halting and economic recovery has been muted. Coming with that halting economic recovery in a global sense has been a huge decline in the general rate of inflation. And in fact, I would argue that even to this date, the excess of commodity, the excess of labor, and the excess of capital on a global basis still makes the risk of deflation probably greater than the risk of an acceleration of inflation. In fact, it's kind of interesting going back a few years when the Fed and other central banks embarked on this money pumping policy. a lot of people came out and said, oh my God, this is going to result in a huge inflation shortly thereafter, and they better stop this, et cetera, et cetera. But that inflation has yet to appear. The liquidity is out there, but that money has not yet found its way into the global system to generate any kind of price inflation in the economy. What it has done, it's been very successful in inflating asset values. And in fact, if we look at the equity market, which is one of the key areas I wanted to focus on, you know, the S&P 500 has almost tripled now from the low that it put in March of 2009, and has basically marched forward almost in uninterrupted fashion for the last going on 5 years. And of course, that culminated last year when the Standard & Poor's, the S&P 500, actually appreciated by some 30% in 1 year, which was almost an unheard of and unexpected rise. It's very interesting when you look at that. Historically, equity prices tend to follow corporate profits. The equity market, almost on a long-term basis, tends to march in tandem with the growth in corporate profits. Well, in 2013, corporate profits rose about 6%. You add another 1.5% or 2% for productivity, and the fact is that on balance, one would have expected the stock market to advance by some 8.5%. And in fact, going into 2013, that was the conventional forecast. Well, equity prices are determined by two things. They're determined by the growth in corporate profits, but they're also determined by the amount that people are willing to pay for those corporate profits, or what we refer to as the price-earnings ratio, or the market multiple. And it was funny, about a year and a half ago, a client of ours asked us to take a look at these two components. Well, corporate profits are pretty easy to forecast. If you know what the economy is going to do, if you can get a pretty good guess on GDP, et cetera, you can pretty much guess how much corporate profits are going to rise. The price-earnings ratio is much, much trickier. But we developed a model which is able to forecast the earnings ratio on the basis of two things. Number one, it was the yield on the 10-year government bond. And number two, it was a 4-year look ahead of the ratio of government spending to GDP, or in effect, government's role in the economy. So we put this historical model together, and for 2013, well, we put this historical model together. In 2012, the market's price-earnings ratio was 12.5. We ran a simulation for 2013 on the basis of our best guess of what interest rates were going to do, which we thought they would remain pretty stable, or at least remain low historically, and on the basis of the fact that government's role in the economy would continue to shrink as the budget deficit declined and spending was controlled. And our model came up with a price-earnings ratio of 18. Said, holy cow, 18, this is unheard of. There ain't no way that the earnings ratio is going to get up to 18. So we didn't believe it ourselves. Well, on December 31st of 2013, corporate profits had risen by about what we expected, and the price-earnings ratio on the S&P 500 rallied to 17.8. And that's principally why the big increase in the earnings ratio was principally why the stock market rallied as much as it did in 2013. It was driven by the fact that interest rates, long-term interest rates, were markedly low, and those low levels of long-term interest rates were driven in part by monetary policy, which was very accommodative and very expansive. And of course, the idea from the Federal Reserve standpoint was to kind of promote this, because the idea was being, well, rising equity prices like rising home values boost wealth. As wealth increases, that tends to be spent. It sort of filters out across the economy and stimulates economic activity. And I dare say it was true to a degree. The problem is that the Federal Reserve did not get the bang for the buck that they thought they would, given the rally in equity prices. Well, given that appreciation, the question is now, where do we stand in terms of the equity market? Everybody always focuses on the equity market. I always call the equity market the best barometer of public opinion out there. Everybody wants to know what the Dow Jones Industrial Average did yesterday or the day before, et cetera, et cetera. And it's viewed as a principal ingredient in formulations of consumer confidence. With the rally that we saw in 2013, a lot of analysts started to get really worried that, in fact, the stock market was getting very bubbly, was getting very overvalued, was getting very nervous, and consequently was due for a sharp correction in 2014 and perhaps even longer. And to the extent that occurred, that would be a real negative for the economy in general, because just as rising wealth tends to boost economic activity, falling stock prices induce falling wealth and consequently have a restraining effect on the economy. So we ran our model again for 2014. We assume, because we continue to think the economy is going to struggle in terms of economic growth, we assume that interest rates are going to pretty much remain in the zone that they have been. Government will continue to reduce its share in the overall economy. And the result is that our price-earnings ratio model forecasts an earnings multiple on the order of 20 for 2014, which, with a 5 or 6% rise in corporate profits, would presume about another 15% rise in equity prices in 2014. So if you thought it was bubbly in 2013, you might think it's especially bubbly if this is right and we move through 2014 in this manner. One of the best measures of sort of the, I guess, the amount of froth, one might say, in the equity market is a measure of total stock market capitalization relative to GDP. In 2000, at the height of the dot-com boom, that measure exceeded 2. At the bottom in 2009, that measure was valued at about 0.6. In 2008, at the height of the recent stock market rise, it was valued at around 1.7, 1.8. And right now, at the end of 2013, it's around 1.6, 1.5. So I think at the end of 2013, we could sort of say that the stock market was pretty much fairly valued. It wasn't overvalued. It certainly wasn't undervalued. And that therefore, in fact, if there was a progression in equity markets into the future, it had to be based more on fundamentals and particularly on earnings. And of course, earnings growth is really going to be dictated by the performance of the overall economy. I dare say I still don't see any reason to get especially optimistic on the performance of the overall economy in 2014. In fact, we wrote a brief piece right at the end of last year explaining why consensus forecasts and the Federal Reserve's own forecast for 2014 was once again simply too optimistic. The Fed's official forecast is for 3% growth and 2% inflation in 2014, and our bias is that inflation is going to be more like 1 to 1.5%, and growth is going to be more like 2 to 2.5%. There's simply nothing out there to suggest that past policies are going to finally bite. The household sector is still suffering from tepid income growth. Job gains are becoming hard to come by, and I think there are institutional restraints on the job market which are going to continue and perhaps exacerbate in 2014. In particular, the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I think that's having a dampening effect on businesses not only willing to form, but businesses willing to hire. And I think as a result of that, hiring in the economy is going to be dampened as we go forward. I'll give you one statistic that maybe highlights that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the official body that compiles this types of data, began compiling statistics on employment in the healthcare sector in 1960. This data is published every month, and every single month, come hell or high water, since 1960, employment in the healthcare sector has expanded, except for December of 2013, when it showed its first decline, followed by a second decline in January of 2014. Hospital providers aren't getting paid to the extent that they had in the past. There are changes in healthcare policies as a result of the act. And I think for the first time, we might say that for the first time, the healthcare sector is no longer a growth industry in the United States. And I think that's going to cause some wrenching changes in the economy because the healthcare sector represents almost 20% of the total. And I think that will feed back through the economy as we move forward as this adjustment is made. But it's not only that. Capital investment in the economy has been weak relative to post-war recovery and expansion periods. Businesses have found it more worthwhile to hoard cash and buy back stock to invest in new plants and equipment. Why? Well, because global demand is weak and because they simply don't see the return on that investment that would otherwise make them change that decision. And then there's the housing market, but I'm going to save that for last because just to sum up a remark on the equity market, I just want to make it clear. We think the equity market will continue to expand in 2014. But I think what you want to watch for now is that it doesn't get too ebullient. When you start picking up the papers and reading about how you have to be invested in stocks, and everybody's promoting stocks, and the stock market's going up even in the face of continued sluggish growth in the national economy, all I'll say is be careful. Oh, let's look at the farm economy. The farm economy has sort of run counter to the general economy in recent years. In fact, I would argue, aside from the oil and gas industry, the farm economy has probably been the strongest sector of the economy, of the national economy in recent years. It's benefited from, I think, three things. Number one, it's benefited from low interest rates and more than ample liquidity. Number two, it's benefited from government policy, particularly the ethanol mandate that was introduced in 2005 and created a whole new source of demand for feed grains. And number three, it's benefited from sort of adverse weather conditions in the 2010-2013 period, which had the impact of constricting global supply and consequently boosting prices. So what does that bode for the future? Well, I always say the best cure for high prices is high prices because high prices tend to have effects of increasing supply and dampening demand, and that, in fact, is what's been happening. Over the past 4 years, there's been an expansion, a huge expansion of acreage outside the United States. A big expansion in acreage in Eastern Europe, a big expansion in acreage in South America, and in 2013-14, weather conditions are improving. And so if we assume normal weather is going to prevail in the United States in 2014, and I think that's the only assumption you have to make. You can't work on the assumption that we're always going to have bad weather, so we'll work on the assumption that you're going to have normal weather. But if we have normal weather in this country in the growing season and harvesting season of 2014, the fact is that global agriculture is going to shift from scarcity to surplus. And as a result, the stocks usage ratio, the ratio of global inventories to global usage of grains, is going to rise back close to the levels that prevailed not so much in 2010 or 2007, but really back to the levels that prevailed in the early part of the 2000-2003 period when stocks were considered excessive. And in an excess supply condition like that, the implication is that you're going to have price weakness rather than price strength. On top of that, you have to consider the fact that for the first time, I think there is clearly political resistance now to the ethanol mandate. And the fact is the ethanol mandate for the first time has actually been reduced as part of the new Farm Bill rather than increased. And so there's another source of demand which at the margin is not going to grow as rapidly as it has. The suggestion I make is that it's more likely as we look forward that we've sort of turned the corner in terms of commodity price in agriculture. And if in fact the dominant trading range, and I use corn as sort of the benchmark commodity, but if in fact the dominant trading range for corn over the past 5 years has been something between $5 and $8, I think it's more likely as we go forward that in fact the dominant trading range is something between, say, $3.50 and $5.50. And so you have to consider the implications of that. You have to consider the implications of that for farm income, which is projected to decline pretty sharply in 2014. And you have to consider the implications of that for cash rents, because cash rents as they existed in 2012 and 2013 simply are not going to support a commodity price in the range of $3.50 to $5.50. And if in fact rents have to come down, you have to consider the implications of that for the price of farmland, which of course has appreciated almost in line with the equity market over the past 5 years. So I think those are some of the things that are going on in agriculture. I think it's safe to say, I wouldn't say it's safe to say, but my own forecast is that agriculture will probably go into some sort of a recession over the next couple of years. It's not the kind of recession that was highlighted in the 1980s where there was a lot of excess debt and a big collapse in the farm economy. I don't think we're anywhere near that. But I think there is a change in trend starting to get underway in the agricultural economy, which will make it a much more conservative-oriented part of the economy than it has been for the last several years. And that's despite the fact that interest rates are going to remain low and liquidity is going to be ample. I think it's more of a structural change than it is anything else, and I just think you should be aware of that and be thinking about the consequences of a possibly new and prolonged lower level for commodity prices. Now, one might argue to retort that is that, yeah, but global demand is just growing. There's going to be more and more people on the planet, et cetera, and that's going to stimulate the demand for grain. Well, it is. There's no question about that. But I always say, and I'm not a farmer by any means, I'm from New York, but my mantra has always been, I never underestimate the ability of the farmer to produce. And I think we're seeing technological change and productivity increases on the farm, running apace. And I don't fear the inability of the farm economy to sort of match the rise in global demand. And global demand, to some extent, is slowing down. China has been a big source of global demand over the last 10 years. The Chinese have expanded production dramatically. I think there's been a tenfold increase over the last 10 years in acreage devoted to corn, to feed grains in China. So production is increasing mightily, but more important than that is that the Chinese economy is slowing down. The growth rate in China of the growth in the general Chinese economy is going to be considerably slower as we look out over the next 5 to 10 years than it has been over the last 5 to 10 years. The reason for that is simply that China is transforming itself. It's going from a manufacturing-based economy to a consumer-oriented economy. In the long run, that's good for consumer demand and for commodities, but in the short run, it's very unusual for economies to make transitions like that in a smooth and uninterrupted fashion. And one of the consequences of that is slower growth than had been the case in the past. Frankly, I've been a little bit surprised that the Chinese have been able to do as well in the last couple of years as they apparently have. A lot of people are bemoaning the fact, a lot of analysts are bemoaning the fact that the Chinese economy is slowing down and it's acting as a drag on the global economy. My own view is that that should be expected, and the fact is that it's not nearly as dramatic as one would have thought it could be. Now, that doesn't mean that an accident can't happen in the future, but at least so far, to date, that transition is being accomplished relatively painlessly. So we've covered two areas. We've covered the equity market, and we've covered the farm economy. And so now I want to touch on the construction market, because the housing economy has clearly moved into a recovery phase, really beginning in 2011. But it's an odd kind of recovery. We had a dramatic housing collapse, of course, during the recession and on the backside of the recession. We wound up with a huge volume of mortgage foreclosures and a huge amount of excess supply on the market. The general feeling was that before the housing economy could negotiate a decent recovery, we had to absorb all that excess supply. Well, prices were very low, and of course, liquidity, like in other areas of the economy, was more than ample, given low interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, homeowner affordability, the homeowner affordability index is essentially the housing price times your mortgage rate, gives you your payment relative to your income. And on a national basis, affordability measures were basically as low, or I should say housing was more affordable in the 2011-2012 period than it had been at any time prior to the collapse in 2007. And so one would have hoped, or at least policymakers were hoping, that the high affordability of housing was going to initiate a vibrant pickup in demand and a sharp acceleration in housing demand. There's only one problem with that. The banks weren't lending money. Why weren't the banks lending money? Well, because Dodd-Frank legislation imposed a lot of restraints on them, because they were afraid of being prosecuted for making bad mortgages again, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, the home buyer, the household sector, really played a much lesser role in the housing recovery that was getting underway than had been the case in previous recovery periods. Instead, the institutional part of the market really picked up. Private equity investors and the like really stepped up to the plate and paid cash for a lot of this distressed housing that was spread all over the West Coast and in the Southwest, et cetera, and effectively dried up a lot of the inventory that was plaguing the market. Well, unfortunately, one of the consequences of that, not for the investors themselves, but for the household sector, one of the consequences of that was that housing prices began to firm up. And in fact, throughout 2012 and 2013, housing prices on balance have risen, I'd say on a national basis, probably using some measures, probably on balance about 15% over the past 2 years, 7% in 2013, and a little bit more than that off the bottom in 2012. As a result, housing suddenly became less affordable to the household sector than it was at the bottom of the recession in 2011. And strangely enough, if we look at 2013, there's really been an absence of the first-time home buyer in the housing market on a national basis. If we look historically, the first-time home buyer has generally represented something on the order of about 40% of total housing sales in any given year. In 2013, the first-time home buyer represented only about 26% of housing sales over the course of the year. In effect, the first-time buyer has been frozen out of the market by the fact, number one, that housing prices have gone up, and therefore housing has become less affordable than it was a couple of years ago. Number two, unlike in the prior 10-year period, home buyers had to put a down payment down in order to get a mortgage, and the banks were becoming particularly cautious with first-time buyers and extending credit and the like. And so as a result, they represented a much smaller portion of the market than had been the case historically. My concern about that is that it's hard to see a vibrant housing market without the first-time buyer, because one of the things that has driven the housing market over time has been sort of the move-up buyer. The initial home buyer comes in and buys the low-priced house, and then after several years needs to move to bigger quarters or whatever, and sort of steps up and is followed by another new buyer, et cetera, et cetera. The recession has dampened household formation. It certainly caused a lot of income constraints on the prime home buying age group, or the young home buying age group, and so thus it's posed a lot of rigidity on that portion of the housing market. I've studied the housing market over time, and I have not yet seen a sustainable recovery in housing being driven by a shortage of supply. Housing recoveries, housing expansions have always been driven by demand, not by a shortage of supply. And one of the arguments that's being bandied about right now, because over the past 3 months on a national basis we've seen a sharp decline in housing sales. Part of it's probably attributable to the weather, but I think there's something more fundamental at stake. In fact, here's one for you. The National Association of Home Builders reports monthly on new home sales. And everybody's been blaming the bad weather, including Federal Reserve officials. Everybody's been blaming the bad weather for the decline in housing activity over the last 3 months. So the January new home sales data came out a couple of days ago. And of course, the weather was horrendous in January, particularly horrendous in the Northeast. And what did it show? It showed a 76% increase in housing sales in the Northeast. Figure that one out. In areas where there was no harsh weather, in the Midwest, it showed that housing sales actually dropped. And on the West Coast, it showed that housing sales actually dropped. So on a short-term basis, you can take some of this data with a large grain of salt. But I think my point is that there's no way that housing sales rose by 76% in the Northeast when we were buried in snow for the past several months. But it's interesting in that a lot of the surveys, what the builders who were reporting earnings in the last month were reporting, they were complaining that it wasn't so much a lack of demand in the marketplace, it was a shortage of supply. And that once land began to be freed up and development tracts could start to be developed, that the supply would encourage an increase in demand. My comment to that is I am highly doubtful that would be the case on an ongoing basis. Now, the only way it might work is that, in fact, we do get an increase in supply that's accompanied by an increase in building amidst weak demand. The inventory of unsold homes begins to rise, and as that inventory rises, it begins to put downward pressure on housing prices. But that's the only way that I can see it. And so my point is I'm very skeptical of the notion that supply constraints are going to drive a continuing improvement in housing prices and in housing demand as we go forward. And if, in fact, the housing economy stalls out, it has been a leader of the general economic recovery over the past 3 to 5 years. And so if, in fact, the housing economy's growth rate begins to stall out, it's really going to be up to an increase in business investment to really step up to the plate, to take up the slack. Now, the argument there is on fairly solid footing. Corporations are flush with cash. Business capital spending has been a relatively weak link in the economy thus far in the recovery. Interest rates are low. And so there's the wherewithal to really step up investment if, in fact, there's the willingness to do so. My feeling is, on balance, that capital spending is not going to be as vibrant as we might hope. I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty that still exists out there in the global economy. I think as a result, the global growth rate is going to continue to be modest by historical standards. And most important of all is that while corporate profits have been growing regularly over this recovery, the one thing that's been lacking more than anything else is the ability of corporations to generate revenue growth. And the reason they haven't been able to generate revenue growth is because they have not been able to get price. Price inflation has been seriously dampened. Price competition is intense. And as a result, that's acted as a restraint on revenue. And as long as revenue growth is tepid, their willingness to finance big capital investment projects is going to be tepid. And that's going to act as another restraint on global growth. So, to sum up, it sure looks to me like the recovery to date has been slower than previous post-World War II recoveries. It looks to me, as I look out over the next year or two, that growth is going to continue to progress, but at a continued slow rate. Inflation is going to continue to be very low, and as a result, I expect the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world to continue to pump liquidity into the economy, to maintain short-term interest rates around the zero bound. And as long as inflation stays low, it means that long-term interest rates are going to stay low. And my best guess, which is certainly more positive than the general consensus out there, is that the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond, which is the rate on the basis of which fixed-rate mortgages are generally priced, is going to more often than not remain in the current range of about 2.5% to 3%. So mortgage rates I expect to stay low, but we really need employment and income growth to generate demand, and so far that continues to disappoint. So with those remarks, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
With the federal debt continuing to expand, I mean, it's going to have to be dealt with. How do you see the feds dealing with this in the future?
Well, I think two things about that. The federal deficit will not contract. The real issue is how the federal deficit moves in relation to the general economy. And the federal debt is growing, but it's interesting, at least in the last few years, the federal debt as a percentage of GDP has actually declined a bit. The reason for that is that the deficit has fallen more sharply than had been expected. And the reason the federal deficit has fallen more sharply is twofold. Number one, I mentioned earlier the effects of the Budget Control Act. And number two, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which essentially finance all mortgages in the private sector now, have been able to reimburse the Treasury for a lot of the loans the Treasury made to them. And so it's been a windfall to the Treasury. So as a result, whereas the federal deficit as a percentage of GDP in 2009 exceeded 10%, in 2014 and 15, assuming just moderate growth and sort of a continuation of what we've had, the federal deficit is probably going to fall to about 3% of GDP in 2014 and 2015. 3% of GDP is essentially the deficit is a non-issue, and the debt as a percentage of GDP stabilizes and becomes a non-issue. The problem is that what happens after 2016. And in 2016, after 2016, the budget deficit would have a tendency to explode. Not because of an increased interest burden from rising interest rates or anything like that. Without even mentioning those other components, two things are at work. Number one, entitlement spending starts to explode after 2016. Expenditures on health care, Medicare, Social Security really start to balloon as the bulk of the post-war baby boom starts to retire. And number two, and one of the things I'm kind of afraid of here, you might recall in the newspapers this past week, the Defense Department published their estimate of their spending requirements for the next 5 years. And in the Obama budget proposal, which will be introduced early next week, it calls for sharp cuts in defense spending relative to GDP over the next 5-year period. There's one problem with that. Even though they're forecasting sharp cuts in defense expenditures, the level of spending that they're proposing over the next 5-year period will exceed the limits, the limited bound under the sequestration by $115 billion. So they're proposing a level of defense spending which everybody is saying, oh my God, this is the end of the world, this is terrible, we can't do this. And yet the level of defense spending they're proposing is $115 billion above the levels prescribed by sequestration. And so one of the implications of that may be that the spending discipline that was introduced over the past 2 or 3 years may start to go by the boards. And this era of spending austerity, not only in the United States, but throughout Europe and Japan, may really start to be whittled away at. And if spending starts to rise relative to GDP, well, from that thing I told you earlier, that would be consistent with a decline in the price-earnings multiple, but at the same time, it would make the budget outlook that much worse once we get into the out years and entitlement spending really starts to explode. So we haven't really dealt with any fundamental problems, I guess is what I'm trying to say in here. They've sort of taken the easy way out and have benefited from some extraordinary circumstances in getting the deficit down relative to the economy over the past couple of years, but it's not going to last unless some changes are made. Yes.
In China, now they're allowing 2 children instead of 1. Doesn't that change the supply and demand in China? And number 2 is that I think all the estimates that you just made will change drastically who's in office. That'll change a lot.
Well, I'm not so sure about that on the latter part. I think certainly a change in the one-child policy in China will have an impact, but it's not something that occurs immediately. It's something that's going to occur over time, and it's consistent. I mean, it is consistent with the idea of China transitioning from sort of a manufacturing-based economy and an export-based economy to a consumer-based economy. And long-term, I think that's positive. I think it's positive for global growth, and I think it's positive for agriculture, not only in the United States but elsewhere around the world. I think as far as public policy is concerned, and the impact of public policy on the elections, certainly at the margin, things can change immediately, but it's pretty hard to turn a steamship in the Hudson River. And things take a lot of time. They take on a life of their own. At the margin, you could see changes be made. But I think there's one thing that will clearly define the elections as we move forward is the role of public policy in the economy. And on that score, I'll just say one thing. If you strip out government from GDP, federal, state, and local government spending from GDP, private sector GDP has been growing over the past couple of years at around 4%. If the overall rate of growth in the economy were 4%, jobs would be plentiful, income would be growing, the Federal Reserve would not have to be pumping the kind of liquidity that it is, et cetera, et cetera. But as I mentioned earlier, in the short run, shrinking government at all levels is laudable in the long run, but it's not without its costs in the short run. And the costs in the short run is sacrificing aggregate demand and economic growth. We're making that transition, but it just doesn't happen overnight.
Don't you think, though, that attitude determines the altitude as far as if there's somebody in there that you're going to believe in, everything starts happening with the banks, with the economy, with the people making investments. Everything changes when they know that things are going to be the right road.
I think animal spirits clearly play a role in the economy, and I think if we could deal with the tax system in an effective manner and make the tax system more efficient and more investment oriented, I think that would go a long way to boosting confidence and stimulating growth.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Give a round of applause.
We got one more.
We have one more.
Do you think immigration reform would adjust the new home buyer market enough if the new immigration reform buyers could
Yeah,
apply for a home?
I think immigration reform, depending on what form and shape it took, I think it would be a source of strength for the economy, for the U.S. economy and for the global economy. It would boost income. It would boost home buying. I had a plan back in 2010-11. I said that what we should do is the government should take a directory of vacant housing throughout the United States. And in order to absorb this inventory, I said what they should do is give H-1B visas to any foreigner who could qualify, homeland security considerations, et cetera, any foreign buyer who could qualify and pay cash for that abandoned housing unit should be given an HB1 visa and allowed to enter the economy and to help absorb the housing stock. That would have been a hell of a lot more effective than having Blackstone go in and buy hundreds of thousands of housing units, renting them out, and licking their chops waiting for prices to rise enough so that they can dump them on the market again. Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor.